Welcome back to Tech, AI and Cyber Live. And joining us next, we have Stephen Eliuk from IBM. And he's going to be talking today about Trustworthy AI, advancing AI ethics beyond compliance. Now, Stephen is Vice President AI and Governance Automation and Global Chief Data Office at IBM, where he leads the development of platform and infrastructure components for machine learning and deep learning in the cognitive enterprise data platform, IBM's Data Lake. Stephen is also focused on applying sustainable AI in the enterprise to accelerate the use of cognition in internal processes while maintaining governance, security, privacy, and trust. His work has both generated revenue and showcased cognition at IBM scale to clients. Beyond AI, he manages all global privacy services for the company on behalf of the CPO. His teams develop, manage, and present those services to all business units globally. So, welcome, Stephen.
Hey, thanks so much, Scott. Pleasure to be here.
Well, it's very good for you to give your time for this session, and we're really happy to have you here, Stephen. So, I know I'm certainly looking forward to this and gaining your insights into AI as well. So, I'll just pass straight on over to you now. And then I'll come back later on and we can discuss some of the topics that we're presenting today.
Sounds good, Scott. Thanks again for the kind intro. Let's get started here. So thanks everyone for being here. We have an important topic that we'll be speaking about today around Trustworthy AI. And what's nice about Trustworthy AI is that we're finally bringing attention to AI in regards to explainability, transparency, fairness, bias, privacy, what goes into AI. And that's really refreshing because for a long time, there's a lot of questions about how these AI systems were being developed beyond certain regulated areas of medical or financial. So it's really interesting to be able to speak about this, and I think we're far enough along as a group now to talk about it more formally in these types of settings. So there is the regulatory risk that everybody's talking about. And this is something that's been looming. Like pre-COVID, I can tell you that I had many meetings with, other senior executives in this space from other companies. And, we would speak over dinners and lunches and such, just regarding the potential to impede progress in AI from regulatory oversight. And that was really scary for a lot of us, from academia, from some of the top universities to some of the biggest businesses in the world. There's a lot of people that, our life is AI. We love AI. It's not, the monetary aspects of it. It's because we love to do what we do. And the risk of regulatory oversight was that, potentially it would impede the progress in this space. And that was really scary. Now, the nice thing that we're seeing is that a lot of different groups have come together, from the EU, or you could take the United Nations here on this list, or the White House, the Canadian government. Just so many different groups have come together and looking at AI in kind of not a single angle. It's multifaceted. You have to consider many, different angles on the topic. And what we're seeing, at least in the last 6 months, is that, some of the same language is coming out from the papers. If you look at the EU draft white paper, or you look at the United Nations AI draft white paper from June, there's a lot of similar languages, around high-risk AI, or potentially transparent, explainable. And the nice thing is that people aren't mixing up transparency and explainability, which is really cool. That people really understand now that, explainability is different than transparency and governance. Transparency and governance is some of the processes and the peoples and the immutable data that should be collected so you can understand how the AI was produced, versus explainability is more in terms of the algorithms and how the solutions come to be. You can take a rules-based solution where you can explicitly see how the solutions come out, versus maybe a very deep neural network where you can't quite see the solution space and exactly how it was formed. Right, so that's what's really nice in this space. But we're using this as a really good showcase to see the themes that are coming out from the regulatory bodies, so that we can start to understand what we need to construct internally for the IBM Corporation, what I'm responsible for, but then also for a lot of other companies who look to us for foundation assets or foundation thought leadership in this space. And that's really refreshing, and I'm really excited to talk to you today a little bit more around the Trustworthy AI subject. And I think ultimately this is some of the stuff that you're going to see in the near future in regards to regulatory oversight of the AI space, beyond that of the medical and financial spaces that are currently regulated. So let's ask ourselves, and we've seen this, and you can query any of those papers that I mentioned previously regarding these terms, but is the AI fair? Did anybody tamper with it, or can somebody tamper with it? Is it exploitable AI? How does it handle privacy? Is it transparent? Can we explain it? Do we understand what goes into it? And the accuracy. Are the right techniques involved, right? Are better techniques involved? Are the solutions that we create yesterday good for today and good for tomorrow? These are all really important questions that we got to ask ourselves. And a lot of it has to do a little bit, as we're going to see on the next slide, around how we operationalize AI. And I think that's the big thing that's coming out right now. What does it take to really work beyond interesting problems and interesting assignments to work on versus something that is really used in enterprise and operationalized and sustainable? That's the big difference that we're getting into these days. And it's great that people are finally asking these questions as what it takes to get there. So trustworthy AI, if we read, on the basics of how we define it, it's a multidisciplinary field in which the main goal is to understand how to optimize AI's beneficial impact while reducing risk and adverse outcomes for all stakeholders in a way that prioritizes human agency, well-being, as well as elemental flourishing. So there's a lot that's, built into that. I have a similar view on this topic space, and I think if we look at some of the papers in the spaces right now and some of the draft papers and some of the high-level individuals who are working in this space who really are seasoned, it's really around operationalizing AI. And to do that properly, you need to have trust in the AI. And to have trust in the AI, we can take it back a slide or so and look at the fairness aspects, the bias aspects, the explainability aspects, the transparency. All of that gets baked into it really means that we can operationalize it. And then past the operationalization of the AI, we have to look to the fact of, is it sustainable? Now, a lot of people don't realize that in AI, the technical debt associated with the solutions and making sure that we monitor these solutions to make sure that they're effective still in practice is about 6 times that of general software development. So operationalizing AI means that we have to be able to trust the AI before we do so. Further to that, we need to make sure that at time of use, it is a valid solution in the space. Because if it was a valid solution previously, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a valid solution now, right? Imagine a couple of different situations. Imagine we had data that was trained, and then that data helped create a solution, and that AI was used in practice. But then then some of the data was redacted. Maybe it's privacy-related data, or maybe it's data that's become stale, or data that's from a blackout period, and we can't actually use that data in the solution that we're presenting right now, right? There's a number of different reasons. Maybe a simple binary problem has now turned into a 3-class problem. And if we don't monitor the AI and monitor the incoming data to make sure that it is reasonable and similar to how the AI was built, we could have problems, right? The solutions that we expect are not the solutions that we built, right? Or the solutions that we're expecting are not the solutions that are being presented. That's a better way to say it. Now, there's a number of issues around trust with AI, and that trust in AI can really impede the progress of AI within the enterprise. If we don't trust it, business leaders, individuals, lawyers, governance bodies within organizations can limit the ability to embrace certain types of solutions. If you have a rules-based solution that is very easily understandable versus a very deep neural network or other types of techniques that are more hard to grasp exactly what they're doing, they're going to revert back to the simpler solution, even if the accuracy of the other solution is much better. So we have to get better at being able to explain these harder techniques, like some of the more shallow learning techniques that we know. So that lack of explainability is incredibly problematic. Now, data quality, that's another really important one. Now, within the enterprise, data quality has always been something that we've always looked towards in terms of, hey, what is the benefit of increasing data quality? What does that really do for us? What we know now, though, is versus like academic type problems or academic data sets, or consortiums that have built beautiful data sets like ImageNet, or some of the various different speech recognition data sets, or a lot of the more typical open source data sets, the internal work that we have, the internal data that we're dealing with, there's not a lot of data, or there is a reasonable amount of data, but there's data quality issues, or there's regional constraints in terms of being able to commingle data together, or potentially, privacy or privacy related issues have redacted data, and we have to, re-understand what the data looks like today. Now, all of this presents a number of challenges because we can't just revolve around this misconception in my mind that with big data, you can just assume the signal will come out. Ultimately, we're dealing with problems where we just don't have enough data. And that is constantly an issue where there's just not enough data. So we got to make sure the data that we do have is good data. So a lot of time goes into validating the data that we have, or validating even just the data that we're producing or using is segregated, at least in terms of the testing data, to make sure that there's no leaking of data between potentially training data and validation and test data, to make sure that the outcomes that we're getting are really the outcomes that are within the grasp of the AI. There's also this problem in that previous example where more often than not, we see ensembles being built where people use multiple machine learning models, sometimes from the same techniques, sometimes from different techniques, to build better solutions, to build better AI. And I've seen it more often than not that they're leaking data between these techniques or using different training sets. And it's like very difficult for us to be able to compare those techniques when they potentially are using different data sets or leaked data. And people are very defensive against this often. But when it get down to the crevices and you really dissect the problem, it can take a simple stride or a simple indexing problem that led to potential leakage of information between these models. Right. And what happens there is when you start to aggregate on all these models together and you build these ensembles using more and more of the data, you eventually use all of the data. And that is a problem because there's no holdout set then. And it's basically just fitting an nth degree polynomial to all of this data. You're just building on more and more models. Your solutions are getting better. And you have to ask yourself, why did the solutions get so good when I started building on these techniques? Maybe the original solution wasn't so good. That's a possibility. Or maybe there's one of those solutions that's better, or maybe it's just that the data was leaking between them. And I really emphasize this problem because this happens more often than not. Now, the third column here, if you look at risk and threats, is really around ungoverned and non-monitored AI systems. I talked a little bit about sustainable AI and what I believed it took to operationalize AI, which is around the trustworthy AI. You need trustworthy AI to be able to operationalize it. That's so you can check all of the check boxes to say everything's good, but then how do you sustain it? If you don't monitor, and there's a great deal that has to go into monitoring the AI systems, dire consequences can come out. You could be using data that's been redacted. You can be potentially mixing data or going beyond the terms and conditions of the current license agreement for the data that you're using, or even the libraries and software that's being used behind the scenes. So you really have to monitor the AI. And that's just some of the general governance concerns. And we start to think more about, hey, how data changes. The problems are changing so frequently too. I talked a little bit about the binary problem that turns into a 3-class problem. These things are big issues. And if you don't catch it and you start sending downstream, business stakeholders or applications or services some of the results, you can have really big problems. And then you're reacting to people coming back or exploiting the AI. And that's a huge, huge issue. So these are some of the pillars that we're building within our umbrella within IBM. And it's really around all of the terms that I've mentioned before. It's around transparency, explainability, fairness, robustness, and privacy. Now, all of these go in to produce trustworthy AI. And without them, I believe you can't operationalize AI. Further to that, the sustainable AI, this all comes into a nice cyclic process that has to take place all the time within organizations. And really, I think this is a really important slide. You're going to see all of these terms. If you look them up in any of the draft white papers that are coming out of the regulatory body, these are the themes. Other themes around, the operationalizing of AI, around sustainable AI, around high-risk AI, all of that, builds on some of these concepts. Okay, so it's really important to take note and understand these. Now, we have to be careful about AI, though, in certain types of decisions. If you don't build AI right, you can have big problems around AI. Now, I gave you a couple examples about the binary and the three-class problem. We can talk about other types of problems and anomalies that happen. And if we don't build really good simulators, if we don't build really good AI, we get potentially dire consequences. We can revert to simple problems like autonomous, not simple, very complicated, but well-known problems, I should say, like autonomous vehicles and the services and such that make them up. That's the big issue, is around the anomalies, the things that don't happen so often than not, right? We have new drivers, we have older drivers, we have statistics that suggest that they're more risk prone. And from that, we know that this is mainly because of the anomalies. That a new driver is a little heavier on the throttle or a little touchier on the brakes. They don't act in a consistent normative behavior, and that's where they present challenges to AI systems, things acting out of the norm. But the issue in these high-risk areas, whether it be drug use, drug discovery, financial services, building human models, building HR models around people, all of these can have impacts around people. And people can lose jobs, or they can be, impacted because of a poor decision that a human could pick out very easily, right? So we got to be careful around the AI. That's why I chose here. Let yourself pick. There's a lot of different problems out there that I think you can gravitate towards, that you can see how anomalies could impact them. But that said, these are happening all the time, and we got to be careful with them. Now, this is a really nice slide because I think it builds upon some of the previous concepts that I talked about around trustworthy AI, and how trustworthy AI leads to operationalized AI. And operational AI needs to have it set up in a sustainable way. Now, if we look at the throngs, and this is actually from Rob Thomas, I think originally, he's an SVP at IBM, but these throngs of this AI ladder, if you think of the collection phase, where you start to collect the data and understand the data, you have to organize it, analyze it, and infuse it. Without any of these, you break down. If your collection phase, if you're missing key data assets and you're hoping to analyze and get good results out of it, but you don't have all the assets, you're leaving potential good outcomes on the table, right? Now, further to that, if we collect a whole bunch of data and we just originally start to analyze and have very poor organizational aspects to it and very poor quality, the solutions are also impacted, right? So all of these stages are really built upon some of the same fundamentals that we see within the trustworthy AI, being able to analyze and understand what goes into AI and move along there, right? So there's a very important set of concepts here to understand if you're trying to build out this type of work within organizations. Now, demystifying data for trustworthy AI. Now, this is a really important one. We have to make sure that you understand the data that's incoming. If it's potentially a duplicate of a known asset that you're using for training, but now you're using it in testing and it just looks a little bit different, potentially your outcomes aren't what you think they are. So we got to be careful about what goes into the AI, what goes into the AI explicitly. That you got to be careful of the data that's being used and really understand the data. Don't just, collect and merge and use data. Understand what it is. Put it through some checks and balances to validate, your assumptions that you're making about it. I can tell you 9 times out of 10, problems are usually not in the algorithms that we're using, but it's in the data that we're using, or potentially in the sustaining of the AI later on. Now here, this is a nice one. If you think of like that whole work in terms of the trustworthy AI building into operational AI into sustainable AI. All of these things kind of fit together. The AI engineering, the governance aspects, the cultural and the design. We have to make sure that all of these aspects are built together to validate the solutions coming are trusted. And I think this is another really nice chart to look at and really spend some time when you have a little bit more time to look at each one of these terms and how they might relate into your own business processes, to be able to understand how you might be missing something, because all of these are pretty essential components. There's a much larger process chart that we have that has hundreds and hundreds of small aspects that kind of feed into these bigger items. But it's a really important one to make sure that the organizations understand or are beginning to understand. Okay. Now, this one is some of the questions and aspects that go into the operationalizing of the AI, which is really important. We got to ask these questions before we get out there. Can we understand the decisions? Is there risk around what we're producing? Is there favoring of one group versus another? All of these, like basically anytime you're dealing with like HR or related, people type use cases, these are high risk use cases because they could impact people, right? So all of these types of AI, we should start to second guess and question and make sure that they're validated and maybe audits and such that go on behind the scenes on these types of AI use cases. So make sure that when you start to see these types of examples come up in your enterprises, that you start to give the adequate resources to really validate the solutions coming to bear are good. Now, this is a really important one for me. It's around some of the tool sets within IBM. Now, remembering, I'm an internal corporate guy. I make sure IBM is good in terms of AI, in terms of sustainable AI, in terms of our privacy-related matters and services for the global company. And I'm not a reseller, so I'm not trying to resell products for you. But one of the big products, and all of these are very, very important in your journey into trustworthy and operationalized sustainable AI. One of the ones that's very important to me on the governance side is around AI fact sheets, the rightmost one. It's really providing the transparency into the algorithms, into the machine learning models, into the process, into the trustworthy AI, into the operationalized AI and sustainable AI. All of those is based on understanding what went into the model, the libraries, the people, the data, at time, the license agreements. All of these different items are really the makeup to be able to trust the AI, be able to govern it effectively. So AI fact sheets is a really interesting one. I'm not going to say that we know all the facts or the recipes that need to be collected for every piece of AI, but I can tell you the mechanisms and being able to store those important facts so that different types of persona can query them is a really important first step for organizations to start to curate that data to make it possible in the future and in this new regulatory AI space that's coming up. Now that's about it. I thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to turn it back over to Scott though. And I think he's potentially, got some questions or some people, on the line with me.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, no, I have had some questions come in while you've been talking, and I've been making some notes myself. I really appreciate that. You probably could have gone on for like an hour talking about those points, but obviously we are up against it. We're against the clock today, so I appreciate you going through those as quickly as possible. Now, if anyone does have any questions for Stephen, you can obviously connect with him direct as well through the platform and ask him any specific questions or find out more information about IBM and AI. But a few questions I had as well. I mean, you talked quite a bit there about governance. Why should business executives care about data governance, and how does that governance relate to trust and adoption?
No, I think that's a really important question. And it's ignored way too often than not, to be honest. And I think it's really around data scientists and the eagerness that they have to showcase good results. Okay. And if they're going to the executives, they want to show a good result. They don't want to show the data sets and such that went into it, how to properly govern it, etc. So I think it's a big issue within the enterprise. And I think that we can take it back to the fact that if we had more seasoned individuals in the spaces, I think that you'd be more well aware. More and more people are becoming more and more aware of it. But the risks associated, we're seeing these regulations come out in some sort of theme right now. They're not actually law, it's not put into practice yet, but we're seeing the themes come out. So I've been coaching the company for several years, the IBM company in this space, but we're seeing more and more of this gravitate towards the fact that you're going to have to do this. So you can either get on board right now and start to be aware of it and give the resources to the teams to do things maybe a little better than they would have, or at least hire their expertise that are more aware of the problems so they can do it properly. But it boils down to education of individuals in the space. You don't learn about this stuff in school. It's not like you can go to university and they talk to you about, can you talk to me about the data governance? Because everybody's working with these open data sets. There's not a lot that goes into it. It's very different in the enterprise. In the enterprise, we're always worried about the data. Is there a blackout period? Is there a regional, constraint of the data? All of these things are really important. But I can tell you, some very, very big companies don't know anything to do with this space, right? So it's good to be aware of it, and I think everybody should take note of it.
Yeah, absolutely. We won't ask you to name the very big companies that you just mentioned there. So, and one thing you did mention at the beginning of that answer was about data scientists and letting them loose. The kids in the sweet shop kind of thing.
Yeah.
What can happen if companies do just let these data scientists loose on a given problem that they think that AI can solve? I mean, what are the potential dangers there?
Well, I think it depends on the organization. So I think if you have a well-seasoned data scientist, a senior data scientist that is well-seasoned in enterprise use cases, they will know the dire effects of going down the wrong directions. Okay, but these people I look for them all the time. I try to bring them in. I try to have them on my team, but they're very hard to find. We're trying to find those individuals that think beyond just the AI. The solution is hard in itself. To create that trustworthy, operationalized, sustainable AI, that's the one that's, the really difficult one. So what happens often is that, like, a rat and cheese, or a mouse and cheese, they go directly for it, and that's the job of a data scientist. They want to show a good solution. Sometimes they mess up. Sometimes they produce a great solution on the surface and it doesn't generalize well, or potentially it uses data that they shouldn't use, or potentially they don't consider the operationalized, sustainable requirements of it, or maybe it's exploitable. So you often get these solutions that, in my opinion, are rudimentary at best, and it's led to very abrasive conversations I've had with people, and it's difficult, but people have to be aware it takes more than just the solution space. You have to consider everything that goes into it, and it's not good enough to just wave your hands in the air and present a solution. You have to be able to justify it. You have to show that what went into it, understand it, and being able to present it well. And that means sometimes the data scientist isn't the one that's advocating for it. Maybe that's a business stakeholder. Maybe that's somebody who's better with the marketing of it that has some technical expertise, right? But it's a very dangerous space and could potentially, result in regulatory fines, could potentially result in, brand reputation issues, right? All of these things could inherently happen because you let people do the wrong thing, right? Imagine the HR space and you start to, use AI, which looks on the surface really good, and there's some, bias in there that's just not fairly treating certain people. And then business decisions are made because of it, and people are losing their jobs, or maybe people are getting promotions or salary increases, and ultimately it comes back that it was wrong. It's really scary stuff. So you got to tread lightly.
Absolutely. Look, we're getting a bit short of time, but I want to try and squeeze one more question in here, Stephen. But if you can try and answer this one in less than 60 seconds, that'd be great. So what makes dealing with data different with AI than in other contexts?
Well, I think, like, if we take a look at, like, deep learning and big data, there's this all the trend, and I know we don't have much time, but it's not about all the data, because we often don't have so much data, right? And in enterprise especially, we have a lack of data, or lack of data that can be commingled, or regional constraints and things like that. So I think that's the big difference, is, like, yes, with a crazy amount of data and the right systems, maybe you can get the signal out from the noise. So data quality might not be such a big issue, but the realities are, for these problems and the techniques that we're trying to use, data quality is incredibly important, right? We got to make sure the data that's being used, just like the gasoline that we put in our sports cars, is good, solid, best of the best that they use, like in Formula One and things like that. We got to check it, and we got to validate that it's good and the data quality, because if you put crap in, ultimately you're going to get a bunch of crap out, right? How it differs from other systems and such, some of the more analytical approaches and such, we can kind of, understand more quickly when there's a problem with the data, when the data is not representational of the problem, or maybe the current data that you're using doesn't represent how it's being used in practice. It sometimes, showcases itself a little bit easier.
Okay, great. I'm going to have to cut you off there, Stephen. Sorry,
okay, it's been a pleasure.
But Stephen Eliuk, thank you very much for your insights today, and it's been a really good session. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
as I said, we are getting very close to the wire here. So stay tuned and we'll be back with the next session very shortly. Don't go away.